everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Very excited to have Caroline Busta with us today for a session called Counterculture is Not Dead. It's just sleeping in a dark forest. And we'll get to what that phrase is gesturing towards in a moment. Caroline is a Berlin-based writer and the founder of a really good platform called New Models. It's like a podcast and content aggregator. I definitely recommend checking it out. And Caroline wrote this really amazing article recently called "The Internet Didn't Kill Counterculture." You just won't find it on Instagram. I think it came out in January of this year, and I discovered it like a month or so ago. And I was like, "What is this?" And she mentioned the dark forest in it. And then our friend Yancey Strickler obviously talks about the dark forest. He came to the Stoa. So it's definitely something that I'm interested in. I think a lot of us interested here at the Stoa, because the Stoa has a little bit of that dark forest vibe going on. So how today's going to work, I'm going to tag in Caroline in a minute, and she'll share her screen and talk about about dark forest and stuff like that. And then we'll have a Q&A conversation. So if you have any question, put your question in the chat. I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself and ask your question to Caroline. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that and I'll read your question on your behalf. So that being said, Caroline, welcome to the Stoa.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be here. Hello, Stoa community. Nice to see you. I'm calling in from Berlin. I guess, yeah, what we'll do is I think I'll introduce to you a little bit about what New Models is, a platform that I co-run with my partner, Lil Internet, who may join us for part of this, and Daniel Keller. But before, and then we'll talk about some of the issues of running a platform, what a dark forest is, what it means to be in a community like this, what it means to run and support a community like this. But now, just as you were speaking, I just put 4 slides to the top of this mini presentation in the beginning so that we can actually talk about this idea from counterculture to cyberculture as a kind of preliminary lead up to the rest of the conversation. So Peter, if it's okay with you, I'll share my screen, and then, yeah, you can also, I encourage you to jump in, Peter, at any moments when you think it connects with previous conversations that you all have had in your community. Okay, sometimes takes me a second to figure out exactly how to do this. Okay, get it right. 1 second. Do you have an image there now? Yeah, okay, cool. So yes, so I co-run a platform called New Models. Newmodels.io is our URL. And we'll get into that in a second. But first, I wanted to set up this idea of, let's see, counterculture to cyberculture. Oops. Well, it's fine, which is a book by Fred Turner that was published in 2006. And it's really important for our understanding of why it's a little bit difficult to talk about counterculture on the internet now, like what's happened between the 1960s when this idea of counterculture was very pronounced in culture and today. And so there's this like sort of 3 points that are always important to make in the beginning, that the internet, which we think of as this really liberating tool, of course, began as a military industrial research tool, as a defense technology to better model the world through mass data processing. So we can remember, like in the 60s, the idea of the internet, the idea of a globally connected Earth was actually like a military program. It was a defense mechanism, you know, a maybe benevolent one, but it came out of the Defense Department. Sorry. Okay. So this early information network was embraced by visionary tech hippies who saw the unifying potential of a digitally connected whole Earth. And of course, also at this time in the 60s, you have people who are working in new media art out in California, and they're also very open to psychedelics. But of course, so are people who are working in the Defense Department in these more experimental areas. So you have a shared area of, okay, here's this technology that could be used for defense purposes or for like world unifying purposes. There's this overlap there. I think sometimes it's important to remember there's a genealogy to this. Of course, then in the 90s and the aughts, these tech-focused entrepreneurs put the World Wide Web to work building the commercial infrastructure for our current neoliberal order. So, you have these three these three different groups that in our head we would normally think of as quite different, like Defense Department, artists, hippies. Sorry, I'm sorry, my screen is it's because I put transitions on it, so it's quite slow. And then tech entrepreneurs who end up recuperating the all the potential that the early internet had first offered. So this is, I don't know, I think there is sometimes some confusion over like who owns the internet or how it was developed or who's really running it. And if in the 60s we had this idea that we were going to overthrow the man with this connected earth, that we were going to that through counterculture we were going to end up in a freer society. That actually happened. Like that dream came true. The internet actually did help us have more tolerant attitudes towards difference, towards plurality, towards expression. The problem is that that kind of expression ended up getting recuperated by the platforms using this liberatory internet. So by the aughts, you have it's not really let's see, it's not really like the strong men who are in power. It's not really like the Trump and the Kim Jong-un who are in power. It's of course the guys in t-shirts who really are the ones who are controlling our society or who are doing the main extraction. So you have this pretty fundamental change as to like where the forces of control are. You have these old strong men who still try to look tough, but at the end of the day, it's still Bezos and Jack who own the platform. So they're still recuperating. We can get very upset about certain political figures or certain autocratic regimes, but it's still the people who own the platforms who are benefiting from that. So maybe that was a very sweeping overview of the thesis of this text, in that we think that these platforms are spaces for expression, for liberation, but in fact, they end up just fueling, the pocketbooks of the people who own the platforms. So a couple of years ago, I've worked in media now for 15 years or so. I realized that working for a paper print magazine, a print first magazine in the culture sector, was having diminishing returns. And it was very frustrating. I noticed that everybody's payments for text were getting smaller, being seen was ever more difficult. And so the obvious thing to do was to start an aggregator where you take all the best text, you put them in one place, and you signal boost. You say, okay, these are the texts that we want to promote together in the same place. If I just posted them on Facebook, they would be distributed. I'd post something, my friend would post something, they'd be lost in the feed. But if we built our own platform, we could take, these 5 friends' texts who we all think are really great, and we can put them in one place, and we can start to create a narrative. So New Models is that. It's a media platform and community that addresses the emergent effects of network technology on art, tech, politics, and pop culture. And this is just a screenshot of our homepage from a couple of years ago, or I guess last year. And this was the initial premise. This is like where we first started getting off of the main networks, was just to start a simple platform that we owned. So if Facebook can change its algorithm, but we are our own algorithm. We decide what goes in the feed, so we have control over that narrative, trying to take back a little bit of the utopian vision of the early whole earth catalog tech utopians. Yeah, as you can see, our initial idea was to say, we're not going to compete with other media outlets. We actually just want to support the best parts of them. We want to be a parallel to them. We want to be a friend to them. We want to give them this extra space in the digital world where the best things they're doing can be showcased. And we weren't really sure what the financial model for this would be, except for maybe some small advertising. But we figured, okay, it doesn't even take that much labor, right? You just build a platform and you take some time curating the best text that you'd be sending to your friends anyway. So we launched this aggregator where we thought 80% of the text will be already published things. And then in that context, every once in a while, we would be able to publish a fresh text. But unlike Facebook, it would have a context. Unlike Twitter, where it's, there's like kitten videos, and then there's videos of like a refugee crisis, or you have this really schizophrenic media environment, we would be able to curate a media environment. So if we put a text out there and it was dealing with sensitive issues, it wasn't going to be misread. We would be able to control the language world in which it existed. Because as we may get into later, one of the big problems with the main stack networks, main stack like Facebook, Instagram, or whatnot, is that anything you post there just becomes an attack surface. It's less about understanding and it's more about deconstructing. But if we created a space where the context was intact, then we would be able to have more nuance with what we were saying. So that worked out pretty well, but we realized we were still reliant on these big stack platforms. In order to get the word out, we still had to post on Twitter, we still had to post on Instagram, we still had to use the digital infrastructure that was there in order to tell people what we were doing, in order to grow the network, and not even so that we could extract from it, but just so that it was effective in doing what it set out to do, which was create a clear signal in the noise. Obviously, the 2010s was a very, very noisy media environment, and our aim was to make it clearer. So in that process, we ended up developing a podcast so that we could pull out some of the macro narratives that were coming up in our aggregation and we could talk about them. And it was very important to us that it was audio first, that it was something that was not going to be written down, so that we could have a little more flexibility with the way we use language, so that we could test things out. And then we could, if somebody said something and it didn't quite sit right, somebody else could question them and they would have a chance to respond. It wasn't just like, an individual sitting in their isolated terminal, typing their thoughts, sending them out into the void. It was a conversation among peers or friends that would give the benefit of the doubt. There was a sense of generosity there. And one of the early draws of the podcast format was that it really encouraged that kind of generosity of spirit, because you're sitting at the table with somebody. You can't just firebomb them with like all kinds of critique unless they're going to say that back to you. So we would start inviting over friends and we would have podcasts, and maybe somewhat like what we're doing today. We found that to be a really great format. Of course, as soon as you start putting a consistent signal out into the media sphere, then you end up developing a community, which is great. I mean, you all are part of the STOA community because Peter sent out a clear signal. But then what do you do with that? What do you do with that group? What do you do with that community? Is it a bunch of atomized listeners who are all over the world but don't really have any way of talking to each other? Anyone who's been on the internet in the past 20 years knows that comment sections of text are oftentimes like just war zones and very quickly devolve. So how do you create an atmosphere how do you create a space for people to interact with each other in response to the signal that you're sending out there? And this is the moment for us that New Models really came together. We realized, okay, we weren't just making an aggregator to solve this problem of media breaking in the 2010s, or the democratization of media, as it's often called. We really needed to create a space, like a psychogeographic space for a community to exist. And obviously, even this meeting here is how Peter is articulating that for the STOA. He's creating a space for the community to see each other, to interact with each other. And so from that moment on, we started, let's see if this will advance. Hold on. Okay, so yes, oh gosh, sorry, I shouldn't have put these transitions on here. So we realized that we wanted to have a public facing podcast and a more private facing podcast, because some things were very ready for public consumption. They were, more rehearsed. We had questions prepared. We were speaking to guests who were sometimes outside of our immediate social groups. There was a certain level of decorum. It was really a public talk. But meanwhile, sometimes we wanted to have looser conversations where there was more trust. And I know this very quickly gets into dicey territory where immediately it becomes something that's kind of right-wingish, like, oh, well, we want to talk about stuff in silent, outside the view of anybody who can scold us for saying certain things. But there is a line there of just being able to want to speak casually with friends and not, giving each other a human space, not always having to be mini CEOs of every single thing you say. I mean, humans don't work like PR agencies. Humans work like humans. They make mistakes. They have questions. Sometimes they're stupid questions. And, being held accountable by a group of friends is vastly different than being held accountable by the entire World Wide Web, right? So we developed two podcasts, one that was for ClearNet or public and one that was paywalled. What we also realized is that when you paywall something, then people start to value it more. And it was just, $5. It wasn't like we asked people to pay $20 a month or a lot higher or whatnot. It was just $5. And suddenly they felt an ownership over this content. And it was so interesting. I mean, we're so stupid. We didn't even think about this when we paywalled the content. We thought it was just a way to create a sense of privacy, but people started really investing. They started writing back super substantial comments, like giving us so much more input into this community. And we realized that we actually had something that was being collectively held. So we started a Discord. And Peter, is everyone familiar with Discord in this community? More or less. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So, it's a space that was initially designed for gamers to chat while playing MMORPGs or just gaming together, hanging out together. And in the past year or two, it's increasingly been adopted by other kinds of communities just because it's not algorithmically driven. It allows a sense of anonymity, a sense of privacy, a sense of community, really. And we realized that we had started to develop a kind of dark forest, to borrow Yancey Strickler's term or Chin Liu's term, a dark forest, a space that is not visible to the ClearNet networks. So just to give a little bit of, I'm very into diagrams. I think the Stoa community is as well. I find it quite helpful to just give an illustration of this. We know what ClearNet is. You remember this old, this old diagram of the surface web, the deep web, the dark web. I'm sure you're familiar with this, where much of the internet activity is below the water surface. And you think of the farther down you go, the like more nefarious or like the more dangerous or I don't know, transgressive the stuff is that happens. And so, okay, that's true. But also, like, if you flip the script on this, you realize that the stuff that's happening above the surface of the web is actually really violent. Like, that's really hot UV rays in the form of extraction. Like, anything that you're putting on Google, anything that you're putting, we'll move back to this guy. Anything you're putting on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Amazon, any of that is being used for fuel to, you're being sold as a product to a third-party advertiser. You are encouraged to respond to different kinds of posts. The more exclamatory, the better, so that you can self-profile yourself. I mean, the case and great example, of course, is last year with the tragic murder of George Floyd. There was an outpouring of expression, understandably, on ClearNet platforms, and there was also a lot of confusion about the right way to use those platforms. And there was firestorms that happened online because of this. But like in the end, who benefited? I mean, the platforms benefited because there was so much engagement and there was so much heated engagement. And every single time you are clicking and saying, I agree with this, I disagree with this, you are further profiling yourself for some, there's some file that, there's some data cache that has your profile. And when you have X, company that's trying to market to, one product or another, they will say, okay, yes, these are people who are also aligned with Black Lives Matter, or these are people who are not aligned with it. And all of these political expressions end up just, you end up just further inscribing yourself into a certain market profile, which then of course is reinforced. I imagine, Peter, you all have spoken a lot about how algorithms end up shaping communities, and or we can speak about it more, but I won't get into it too much here if that's okay. And so, okay, so you have ClearNet. It's actually, we used to think that this was like the happy, safe zone, and everything beneath the surface was like very dangerous and to be, carefully explored with like VPNs and Tor browsers or whatnot. But fast forward to the late 20 teens, and actually this zone just below the surface of the water becomes vastly more caring and nurturing. There's a layer of protection from this kind of extraction. You're not immediately visible to all of these sensors and to other peers who might be surveilling you. Especially in the culture sector, this becomes something which is important because, I mean, it's a ever smaller pool of resources for culture sector creators, and they are competing with each other to have the right opinion, or to call each other out, to displace each other's legitimacy for a certain grant, or to disrupt whatever status they think somebody has. So just below the surface of the water, or in this case, we'll say now the forest, you can breathe a little bit more. You can be a bit more experimental. You can not be yourself. You can not have to show your face. You can change your name. You can relate to people without all the baggage that the ClearNet would require. I mean, one thinks about how if you are experimenting, or if you just feel like you're non-conforming to, like, gender or age or nationality or ethnicity, the ClearNet platforms make you tick those boxes. They make you say that you're an XYZ who lives in 123 street. But in the dark forest zone, you don't have to perform what the internet you've registered yourself to be on the internet. You can actually play a lot more with that. So for us, that was very exciting. And we try to be like a transition zone between ClearNet and dark forest. So some of the two big differences between ClearNet and dark forest is the difference between algorithmic and user direction. We know that in the ClearNet space, if you say you like pasta, you're going to get ads that say, okay, would you like some more pasta? But nobody likes to eat pasta every single day, so that's actually a bad model. In the dark forest zone, people forage for content. The currency you have is sharing high quality content with others, sharing high quality commentary with others. That becomes the currency, not just like attention, like who can get the most likes, but really how can you build the community? What can you offer this community? And so that for us was a pretty interesting model. Furthermore, you find that this center area of the dark forest is a highly social zone, whereas the ClearNet zone is quite commercial. You're immediately put into some algorithm that's trying to market certain things to you. And of course, if you go very far into the dark net, it becomes commercial again. I mean, actually, I logged on to like I was just exploring like the darknet, and I put on my Tor browser, and I like found whatever addresses. And if you go to like Silk Road, or you go to any of those like kind of Audis era darknet places, they're really, I mean, I just imagine they're like FBI guys undercover fishing other FBI guys. Like, it only really exists in the realm of cosplay, I think. But it's like, oh, do you want to get somebody assassinated? Do you want to buy guns? I mean, maybe some of that's real, but I just think a lot of it must just be like a weird, like I don't know, some kind of fantasy fetish or something. But the central area is really social. So that's the other big difference. My partner Julian and I, we've been writing a lot about techno recently, and it's just occurred to me that, I mean, of course, what we're just doing is creating the club in the dark forest space. This is Trezor in Berlin, which actually like the old Trezor, but it's it's just you're creating a club space that is a little bit dangerous, but that is, also the danger is part of the appeal. You're in very close proximity to each other, even though there's a degree of anonymity. And so we're basically just creating a club. That's what the dark forest is, right? The dark forest is basically a club in digital space. So as we were saying briefly before, the important thing though is that there has to be an air exchange. One detail from I was reading about the history of Trezor, and there was such bad air return, like HVAC return, that some of the DJs would actually bring oxygen tanks with them, so that they could stand for a couple hours as they played their sets. And without the oxygen flow exchange, then you end up having a kind of death within the forest. Likewise, the nutrients from the forest can feed the clear net. And so I feel like one of the challenges that we have now in 2021 is figuring out how to better link these spaces in a way that's not extractive, in a way that preserves the integrity of the dark forest privacy and intimacy, but that does let some kind of exchange happen. The other problem with dark forest is you end up, we talk a lot about filter bubbles in the Web2 social media, but you end up, of course, with the filter bubble in dark forest as well. And you end up atomized. So, some of our friends have also started their own communities, and, these kinds of crossover events, like actually what we're doing right now, end up being increasingly important because you need to have a more Mediterranean model, like the old Roman world Mediterranean model, where okay, during the winter time, you didn't have much sea travel because the weather was very bad and you had to travel by land and it was quite arduous. But during the summer months, those channels were open. And suddenly, you had Nile River Delta and Bosphorus connecting. You had, the exchange of different kinds of goods. We need to come up with a Mediterranean model for these dark forest zones. And how do we do that? That's this other question. What is our new commons? What will that look like? I mean, in one way, we can sort of misuse ClearNet platforms, and that kind of works through fake Instagram accounts or Finstas or collective accounts or gaming the algorithm. That kind of works, but there are other problems that come into play there, like archiving and again, privacy. But what would a different kind of public commons look like? If we think on a more macro scale and we consider how platforms, we are in the Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon stack. Of course, in China, they're in the Baidu, WeChat, Alibaba stack. We start to have regional differences because of digital protocol separation. So would it be possible to have a dark forest commons, which could also cross over some of those state barriers? I mean, that would be really revolutionary if we could have dark forest spaces which could connect despite the different international protocol barriers. So that's another thing that would be quite interesting to figure out. This is a diagram that one of our community members, Jack Ricker, drew. We were trying to spatialize this again. He's like, well, imagine the content is just this liquid, this water, and there's all these like little mini castles, and the water is just spilling out from one to the next, to the next, to the next. It's just all these pools that we're sharing, because that's kind of how memes work, right? Memes fluidly pass through communities this way. Information fluidly passes through communities. So what if this were a model? There's infinite ways we could spatialize this, but I think it's a really interesting thing to consider now. Okay, so coming to the end of this monologue part, these are some of the questions that are on my mind. And again, thank you, Wolfgang Tillmans. I'm just pulling up a picture of an after party, right? Because this is, to me, how the dark forest space often feels as a moderator. Dark forests need clear net connection or they risk irrelevance. So they need to be connected to some kind of mainstream. Like, you may not like the mainstream, it's so necessary in order to have life flow through you. Again, I keep looking at these maps of old Roman roads and it's really in my head. Like, you still need to have a pathway to the primary roads. Otherwise you end up like, I mean, maybe it's interesting, but being totally off the grid it's a very particular kind of choice that is, I think, quite reactionary. I don't think you can do too much if you are just fully off the grid. I think you do need to have at least occasional connection to the mainstream. And two, dark forests need connections to each other. Otherwise, they risk isolation and mutation in maybe negative ways. So those are the two like macro challenges. And then underneath this, I'll just briefly read them, but then I'd like to open this up to a less monologue format. One has to think about the energy cost of moderation in these dark forest communities. Maybe Peter, you can relate to this. It's really energy intensive, especially when you're encouraging maybe like you're like more, people speak about inclusivity. They're usually speaking about these stock like liberal ideas of different kinds of diversity or accessibility, which are really important. But there's another kind of inclusivity, which is like, well, we're not going to deplatform somebody. We're not going to excommunicate somebody for airing an idea that maybe is a little bit on the edge. Like, no, we're going to sit with that idea. We're going to take the interesting things from it. And we're going to say the things we don't like, but we're not going to excommunicate them. So when you open up a space like that, moderation is really, it can be totally exhausting. And you end up spending 90% of your time on 10% of the community, or even a broader 95% of your time on 5% of the community. And kicking somebody out of the community has its own kind of trauma. So it's all like crazy. And imagine that everybody is in different time zones worldwide. So it's 3 a.m. Someone just dropped the meme that's like really not okay in your Discord. People are responding to it. What do? Do you respond? It's 3 a.m. You're totally exhausted, but it's only 3 in the afternoon where the person posted. So there's a lot of, it's this new time zone less plane has bio problems as well, like human flesh problems as well. There's also the energy cost of democracy in dark forest spaces. There's a lot of idealism about running something democratically. In practice, it is a lot harder than it sounds to actually do something that's fully democratic and inclusive. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit more later. So in short, how does one preserve the ethics of democracy without, and how does that match the reality of what a democratic system actually looks like in these dark forest spaces? Then who reaps the value from content produced in these spaces? So if people are offering thoughts and somebody else takes a thought, they may say, oh yeah, but that was my thought and now you wrote a paper on it. Or, you as a community post a meme, somebody wants to have authorship, but they also don't want their name released. So you can't actually air it to ClearNet. There becomes a lot of really sticky ideas about what it means to share content, own content. Oftentimes also, we've all learned over the past few years that extraction on these ClearNet platforms is net negative. But we're thinking on this macro scale, like, a billion people on Facebook, as opposed to actually it's just 1,000 people on a Discord server. And just like, it's like something that, it's very nice to eat at a reclaimed wood table. You can feel very good about that. You can't make a billion reclaimed wood tables and hope that every single person can eat at that table. So there's certain things that make a lot of sense at one scale that just don't make sense at another. But the inverse is also true. Something that's very bad at this scale can be actually quite fine at this scale. So discussions of scale in these communities and how they scale. Community memory, how to handle an archive in this space. Do you want no trace? Do you want to keep it? What does that mean? What about the economic sustainability of doing this? If this is, it's not our full-time job, even though it might as well be. We also do social media for a techno label, and I write and do other kinds of things in order to pay my bills. How do you sustain a community like this? What happens when the dark forest dies or is clear cut? Like, the goal is that they'll just last forever, but is that sustainable? Like, how do you think about the longevity of these spaces? I mean, I guess it's really similar to a club, which is again why I have this image behind these questions. And then of course the dependency on Web 2, Web 2.5, Web 3 creator to fan platforms. So at the end of the day, we're still using Discord, we're still using Patreon. Peter's and you all are using Substack. They're kind of fine stopgaps for now, but ultimately, should we be writing our own software? Should we be coming together in guilds of kind of like-minded or sympathetic, like larger creator communities, so that we can collectively own our own software? There's a lot of interesting questions to be asked there on the infrastructural level that should be explored. So I think that's, let's see. Yeah, this is I think more or less where I think the new models community is, somewhere between these very kind of wild futures that are really living in a more gaming space logic, and in the material reality of climate change and just the earth we live on. We need to do something about. We need to engage in the material as much as we engage in the digital. So this is sort of the zone where we are. Anyway, thank you. That's the monologue part of this. Now I'm excited to get into a two-way dialogue or multi-forum dialogue. Oh, I'll stop screen sharing here.
That was so good. Really well done. And I'm excited by it. And so maybe I'll share some kind of just some fragmented thoughts, and maybe there's a question I can tease out there. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, put them in the chat for Caroline. I'll call you on you in a moment. Yeah, so after I wrote that kind of like that mimetic tribe culture war piece, and then I read Yancey Strickler's kind of dark forest piece, it's like I love it when like I come across a mental model that just kind of harmonizes your mind for a moment. And I'm like, ah, this is like dark forest is a thing. Yes. And then when you introduced me to that tripartite recently about kind of a clear net, dark forest, dark net, it's just like, oh my God, yes, this is it. And a lot of the stuff you were saying are things that I've been trying to think about, but using different languaging. But it's like the idea of getting to right relationship with those three things.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's like mainly like say the clear net and then the dark forest. Um, and not getting seduced by the incentive structure of the clear net. And like with like, because there's a presence, there's still a presence in the clear net and it has to be there. But then it's like I'm trying to use it as a beacon, what I call minimum viable spectacle, to get people into the dark forest so we can cohere here. So that the idea of getting to right relationship. And the other thought that came alive is like this art of dark foresting, like how to do dark foresting well. It kind of bifurcates in my mind, like effective dark foresting, just being good at it in like a technical sense, and then like a moral dark foresting. Um, so yeah, I'll pause there to see if anything came alive for you with anything I said.
I'm interested to hear what others may have to say in response to this, what your
Cool.
experience may be in these spaces.
Um, so yeah, let's pivot to the Q&A. Evan, I'll take you in.
Yeah, let me scroll up. I won't read the question exactly, but so my question is basically surrounding the trade-offs, say for communities, creators of communities, as well as participants in communities, if we want to look at that distinction, though it's not quite such a duality there. Specifically, so your presentation matched with my own experience where, and you kind of went into this in that very second to last slide, where Discord and Slack and Substack and Patreon are like centerpieces of the current sort of like dark forest ecology. And I guess I get the sense that we're living on borrowed time with that. One thing that I find deeply disturbing is the extent to which these dark forest, enclaves are completely dependent on, in some sense, the goodwill or at least lack of active bad will of for-profit companies that we have no reason to suspect are any more acting in our interests or in the interest of some notion of the commons than the big tech platforms are, like the Facebooks and Twitters and Googles of the world. So, I've, as an old school kind of open source nerd, it's really been disturbing to me, say, the move away from IRC to Discord. That like there's been a big move away from open interconnects and platforms and protocols to these closed proprietary things. And so I wonder, like, if you have thoughts about those trade-offs, and maybe if you agree that it might be good to try and nudge the equilibrium a little bit more, towards not getting stuck in these for-profit platforms with huge switching costs and so on, and just any more specific thoughts you have about that. That's kind of where I was trying to go with the question.
Yeah, Evan, I'm so glad that you mentioned that because that's absolutely aligned with a conversation that we're having here a lot, and also weighing, the affordances and potential hazards of doing something in the Web3 space with, different kinds of like tokenization, not for speculation, but for community being able to own basically. If you, I mean, I really, I'm not a developer, so I can't go deeper than this. But there's like I think it's called like the ERC20 token, right, that allows a community to stay intact even if it moves from a platform. So if everybody is registered with this token, then as part of the community, then if we would love to get off Patreon. It would be wonderful to get off Patreon. It's difficult to build the infrastructure. I mean, it's totally possible, but there's certain forms of resistance that have kept us from doing it that are boring to get into right now. But if you're able to own your own community, then even if you are using these these private platforms, then at least you have the ability to move with more agility. There's kind of these two things that are happening. Like on the one hand, you need to just build the community. There's like the social technology that you're constantly working on every single day. That is making sure that your community feels good. There's kind of a good atmosphere. There's like a tolerant mood the more good and tolerant your mood is, the wider ability you have to take in all kinds of new ideas, the more stable that platform is. Also, the easier it is to switch from one platform that may have certain kinds of UX that incentivize certain things to a different kind of platform, which is going to take the re-education of the entire community at once. So, oh yeah, Julian, sorry, my partner Julian's here. He thinks a lot about this as well. So he's been listening to our conversation on.
Hi. I'm sorry, I was going to jump in on this one real quick too, because I think it's a totally good point to make. And I think first of all, of course, there's a difference between platforms, though, even if they're corporate for profit, that you pay for, like Discord via Nitro Boost, et cetera, and those that are ad driven, and essentially with all of the dark patterns and ad revenue dependent algorithms that are placed there to just keep your time on the platform and engagement as high as possible. I mean, those are really the core of a lot of the social media toxicity. So, I think with Discord, at least there's not that the sort of dark patterns and toxic algorithms, because it's not ad driven. But I think we're definitely like looking towards open source or alternative models. I think, though, in the beginning, the hard part is you kind of want building the community to be as frictionless as possible. And in general, the easiest way to do that is the platforms people are used to. I think once you actually get your community to a mature and really where there's a really strong collective will to move together, I think it's totally makes sense to actually move to open source or alternative models of platforms. But of course, it's like the reduced friction is the reason why you choose to use Patreon, and it's very difficult to move off. So yeah, it's always a bit of a balance, but I'd imagine it would be hard to start a new community using only open source or kind of proprietary platforms. People aren't too useful. It depends
on your community too, though.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have more tech literate community, or if your core is more tech literate, then there's a big part of big education that can happen with the others. And I think that you're going to see a lot more tech education. I mean, obviously, like younger people are just like more nimble with it because of gaming interfaces or whatnot. But yeah, I think there's going to be hopefully a big movement of tech education. And yeah,
I'm still constantly baffled at how platform cooperativism isn't a bigger talking point discussion, why more things haven't been launched, like driver-owned version of Ubers, et cetera. And I really hope we're just in the consolidation phase right now or something, and it's going to take off in the next few years. But I mean, absolutely something everyone should keep in mind.
Any follow-up, Evan?
I guess a follow-up, maybe comment, if you have a response to it, is I guess it strikes me, so like taking advantage of the relative lack of friction of some of these, commercial but not yet totally evil algorithmically harvesting platforms like Discord or something, seems like building up a sort of something in the same spirit as a sort of technical debt. You're sort of pushing off to tomorrow, dealing with a very important issue of sort of sovereignty of the community. And so I just, it feels like, I guess I can see how that makes sense as a trade-off, but I also worry that so many people make that trade-off.
Yeah, technical debt. That's a great term. Minimal viable spectacle and technical debt are two terms I'm taking with me today. That's great.
Yeah, and I think we are worried about it. And I think you're totally right. But yeah.
We're also actively working with developers in our community to try to build things that are like not Patreon and not Discord. So hopefully, like, who knows? They're all experimenting. So yeah.
But very good point.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah, this is really cool. I imagine there's like going to be a community of practice with dark foresting. We can share all these, what we're doing. Zeth, I'll take you in next.
Hi guys, that was really cool. So I think the most salient aspect of this talk so far that I was able to extract, and thank you for your presentation, it was really nice, is I hadn't heard of the dark forest. Of course, ClearNet, we never really call it that, but now I know that that's what it is, and the dark net were obvious, and that there was this interstitial space is clear to me that I haven't really discovered it. And I think it's interesting thinking about it while you're talking that why haven't I discovered it? Because I'm a dark forest person, and it's because I'm dark in the physical world. You know, I have a corporeal dark forest existence, and I haven't taken time to go into the internet and find those things. I'm a little bit technological. I have chops there, but I don't actually end up. I mean, I actually studied VR, but I don't ever put a VR headset on my head. You know, like I'm just not that interested. You know, so I guess my question for that is, and I know that, you know, my inertia currently in the ClearNet is not a service to my time. I need to get out of it, and it's mostly you know, habit at this point. Like Facebook is a waste of my time, and I love to make that transition. And I wonder how to do that. What's the interface to the dark forest? Because I feel like that's really where we can be creative, as you've pointed out.
I want to say one thing in response, but I'd also be interested to hear other people's thoughts on this. My short answer is I also come back to what Evan was saying. Distinction between like the creator and audience is very blurry because a lot of times everybody is everybody else's audience and everyone else's creators. But I think there are people who start these media nodes who are good aggregators of other voices, other ideas, and they often are the portals to dark forest spaces because, you know, through Peter, then, you know, you find Yancey and you find other people that have come to the stoa, and they maybe you can only access their material through dark forest spaces. So I think it's just, and then you realize that none of your friends are even hanging out on social media. So that's what I find. I mean, I really have very few relations on ClearNet social media, with the exception of Instagram being like a professional space where if you have a text that comes out, you're like literally have contracts that say, and you'll post this to your socials. It's like part of your contract at this point. So, you know, that I use for professional use, but yeah, my friends are in the dark forest. But I'm curious also, do you want to say
Well, I would
something
just
too?
one quick thing is that, I mean, what's interesting is to just, I mean, I don't know, social media became very advertising focused, all these people, you know, using their platform as to show themselves as a personal brand, and a lot of the dark forest minded people really leaned into that and was like, okay, we're just going to run our Instagram as if we were a corporation, and they end up sharing passwords, having group accounts, usually pseudonymous or over an umbrella an umbrella name basically. And they so generally it's like you still have to seed, you know, you still want to attract new members or be able to communicate to the wider world, and usually it's through like finstas, like group shared Instagram accounts, or for running your own account really as if intentionally, as if it was a corporate presence to your forested life. So
Yes, as if you
Yeah,
wanted to follow up.
it sounds like what you're saying is you need to have some friends in the dark forest. So how do we find you friends?
Well, we hang out in our Discord a lot. Unfortunately, Discord is Discord, but that's where we spend a
I
lot of
mean,
our time.
also, unfortunately, with Evan's perspective is, I mean, Substack and Patreon are the two main nodes right now.
Yeah.
And then, of course, those people generally still do have Twitter presences. So, but I would say generally, like Substack, a lot of Substack operates on its own as almost an email-based dark forest. And then
But this is the question also. Again, where is this dark forest commons? There should be a dark forest commons, but
Right.
it's not that difficult to get into the commons. Maybe it takes work to get into the different communities. That resistance is kind of productive, but like you should be able to like find a commons. You should used to be able to go to a record store, right? And like you knew there were good record stores and there would be like amazing selections, and you could just, if you spent some time there, you would then find amazing things. Like where is that like used bookstore, or where is that record store that's really amazing, that is the common of dark forest? Yeah, that's what I would love to figure out how to build or how to spatialize or connect.
That's the platform co-op that's necessary.
Yeah,
Someone needs to construct
totally.
that and make it public domain so that interface is general and well understood, and people can find their way into it. Yeah, because I still don't. I mean, I'll follow. All I can do is follow folks here and pay more attention, and I'm sure I'll find a way. But it's like you're not saying here, follow this link, and you're going to find this underground world, because that's too clear, and it's too apt to be co-opted by commercial interest. Just that
Yeah.
clarity, you know.
Right. There has to be some incoherence. Yeah.
Very cool.
Thank you, Seth. Yancey Strickler, can I take you in for share any thoughts that's alive?
Yeah, I really enjoyed that talk, Caroline, and thank you, Peter, as always, for hosting. I was just thinking about, when I introduced the idea of dark forest, I was thinking about like the need for this space was a need for safety online, and a place where you could be temporary, a place where you could try things and not have to wear them for the rest of your life. And to me, like the power of the dark forest is is as a like flexible container that provides its members safety. And to me, I see the impact of the dark forest on the 21st century as being similar to the corporation's effect on the 20th century in terms of its like just the organizing principle through which culture is shaped. But I think what's happening with dark forest now is that they're becoming launching pads. Like, Wall Street Bets is a dark forest that is manipulating, the stock market. These become places for coordination that can, influence the quote unquote real world by like trying to get in people's feeds or just trying to get attention, or by, plotting and creating things together. And I think we're going to see we're in like the professionalization, beginning of the professionalization stage of dark forest. With DAOs, is clearly people are going to try to use that as a form. Co-ops coming into this structure is also going to be something people will try. But to me, this is like, this has really been the last 18 months. This is being written live. And to me, the point of it is about the safety. And so, I want to be able to show my head in the clear forest when I want to, but I want my default to be that like we're safe here and we can explore in this space. And that's what I think is so important to preserve about them.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that is definitely their main appeal, especially during the past few years where the ClearNet space has just felt it really has felt so hostile. You can't tweet or say anything in that space without having it be an attack surface, sometimes for good, but more often than not for bad, because it's more valuable in that ecosystem as a space, as something to take down, as something to problematize. But my question, and maybe this is one actually for you, Yancy, is you've done a lot of work in developing off ClearNet spaces or Web 2.5 type thinking. How will we connect beyond our enclaves? Where do you see that public sphere emerging?
It's probably the channels that exist, but maybe maybe the world is more atomized. Maybe we're only talking to each other when we have these strange culture clashes of like my subculture and your subculture start caring about the same thing, maybe for totally different reasons. But to me, the outcome maybe is more atomized. Like maybe this is the post Tower of Babel moment, where we are all cast into our different places, and that we're going to find we're going to find downsides to this. So there's going to probably be an increase in close network cooperation and maybe a decrease in like cross network cooperation or something like that.
Yeah. And how do you see this working on a global scale? We were just doing an EU conference earlier this week and talking about the realities of these different stacks and the realities, of course, of different connectivity within these stacks. But how do you see dark forest networks proliferating beyond the EU-US stack? Do you have any insights on that?
Well, it seems like that's happening in like WhatsApp groups. I mean, it definitely seems like there's a lot of that. The group lists is such a big deal of it. Where I immediately jumped to something you had in your slide, which I really appreciated, which is the time zone shit of coordination. Just how hard, as being a community manager in this, is just crazy how much how much there is to think about to do even a simple thing.
Yeah. And the consciousness that everybody in these communities is literally in a different time zone. Somebody's super caffeinated. Somebody else has just put their kid to bed. They're like in very different realities, arguing over the same, some tiny point.
I would also say the dark forest as the launch pad idea is something I definitely have been seeing as super ascendant. And I mean, I imagine, since it is pretty difficult on social media in its current culture to build sort of a broader, say, activist movement that actually is pluralistic, but gathered around a similar macro agenda. I mean, yeah, things like activist hedge funds, like Engine Number One is one that just raised enough money to get board seats on Exxon's boards and change their policy or business plan away from fossil fuels. And another thing I was just thinking of is, in the past couple of months, there was a oil pipeline hacked. There was a beef producer hacked. Those both seem to be kind of for-profit driven ransomware. But what if they were activist hacks, beef, oil, climate activist hacks? I mean, these are the kind of actually big scale activism and kind of pushback against the more toxic corporate forces in our world, or governmental forces that can actually be built via the unity and kind of collective action that a dark forest can sort of sustain. So,
and that's when we'll start to see states take actions against these spaces.
Yeah.
Once they start being used for those kinds of actions.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess already you just think of Telegram, and Telegram is for the Belarusian activist who was
They forced a commercial plane to land in their country is extremely scary, and that's from a Telegram channel. Yeah.
And then, of course, I mean, China, the yuan is going to be digital now. You think about all the other forms of tracking that are going to be implemented to counterbalance activity in dark forest zones. We may not be able to see what you're saying, but we know where every single penny has gone. So we can build profiles based on other kinds of activity.
Yeah, we're approaching the top of the hour, and this session is begging a follow-up on maybe a panel from people who are doing dark foresting to discuss this. Yancey's Bento, maybe Anna Gaff from Intellect. Yeah, it's really cool stuff here. I'll make some closing thoughts in a moment, but Caroline, Little Internet, would you like to make any closing thoughts or anything that came alive for you in the session today?
I mean, I'm just excited to see a bunch of faces that I'm not familiar with, or names that I'm not familiar with, or pseudonyms I'm not familiar with, and it's wonderful to know that there are all these different pockets of dark forest kind of thinking that are emerging, and I hope that there continues to be coalition building in some capacity as even this year plays out.
Cool. Yeah, one thing I thought that came alive for me in this session is finding the others, because I used to do in-person groups, philosophical groups in person in Toronto, and it was good. I found a lot of cool people, but it's only when I started the Stoa, it's I felt like I found the others. It's a spiritual kinship happened here. It's you throw a beacon up in the noosphere, and then all these cool people start coming, and it's really because I was loyal to the vibe or the aesthetics that appealed to me, and if it appeals to me, that'll appeal to people who are similar to me. So I think that is sort of another interesting facet of this dark foresting, the aesthetics and vibe of it, and finding the others. So I'll plug some events in a moment, but Caroline, Little Internet, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today. It was a great pleasure. We got some cool events coming up. Tomorrow, Pat Ryan is coming to the Stoa, talk about apex aliens. So UFOs exist, do aliens? And if they do, they might be the apex predator. So that should be a fun little session. And June 10th, Jote and I are going to have a session called Seducing the Galaxy Brain. We're going to do a Hegelian synthesis on the galaxy brain. It started off as a positive thing, then everyone started dunking on it. How can we get the best of both worlds, seduce our inner galaxy brain, but with intellectual humility? And then Noam Chomsky and Natalie Wynn, ContraPoints, big event coming up on, they're going to be in conversation on the future of the left here in the dark forest. That is the Stoa on June 28th. So you can check all that out on thestoa.ca. That being said, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Ciao.